the one thing I want to clarify is I've been reading a fair amount of hopelessness and despair over how bad everybody is. And
why are you laughing? It's not funny. It's very stressful.
It's kind of funny. Yeah. And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to comment on it, partly because in some respects that's the point. Because we will finally try new ways of behaving when we finally run out of all the other options we have available to us. The problem for most people that are trying to work their way out of shame and all the things that come along with it is they end up using the same method that got them there. And that's what the problem is. So we run out of all the methods that we usually use, all the steps and how-tos that go along with it, and we say, well, this isn't going to work, and that is the beginning of change, is when you run out of options. So, on that point, we've got 5 more dimensions to walk our way through for the rest of the semester. These dimensions that I've been talking about, kind of the characteristics of pure glass people, are really meant to help you discern what it is to cultivate, not do. Because cultivation is a matter of time. And remember what we said, the difference between reformation and transformation is time, trust, and freedom. And this next item that we're going to be going into will invite you down the rabbit hole of shame, or it will give you an opportunity to look at another way of doing things. And that's true for all of these that we're going to be going through from here on out. Because if you remember the pyramid we went over, starts with truth and reality, it goes to, anybody know what the next one is? Today's topic is control, and then boundaries and forgiveness and conflict, and then intimacy. So each one, the question is, how do I cultivate these things in my life in a way that is based on the grace that gives me space to do things differently, rather than doing things perfectly. So on that point, we will get to this soon enough. Let me pray to get us started here, and we'll go. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for a spring break to get some rest and maybe even some new perspective, whatever that might be, with different experiences people have had. I pray that you'll guide us, continue to guide us through this material, that we will trust you and trust your heart, and be willing to use a different way of relating to you and relating to ourselves and walking alongside other people, and help us just to gain a little bit more understanding of that, not all of it, but enough so that we can accept ourselves as we are and also accept the people around us as they are. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so this is where we go. Shame and grace in relationships, the scourge of control. And on that point, you get to assess yourselves. You can't change what you don't identify. You can't change what you refuse to accept. Don't gag, Abigail. They won't help you. No, they won't. I promise. So, fill it out. Take your best shot. I'll tell you what the key is when you're all done. What's that look for?
I'm just having a lot of fun.
You're not a very good liar either.
Nope.
When you're done, it's just a straight count on the back side. How many you marked with an X or a check or whatever. Okay, all done? Okay. Now, let me make one comment about this, or at least clarification, and that is that the further in we go with this stuff, the more you'll get the impression that I'm saying all control is bad. I'm not. I think my fundamental assumption, or at least conclusion, based on what happened in the Garden of Eden is the issue was control. It always was. If you think about how Satan actually tempted Adam and Eve, it was, don't you wish you had the kind of control God did? And the other side of that coin is Adam couldn't control the situation because it was already out of control, and so he joined along for the ride. And so all control is not bad. Self-control, obviously, is one of the fruit of the Spirit, clearly. What we're talking about is when we spend all of our time focused on trying to control things we all would admit we have no power to control, but yet we still feel compelled to do. So, here's your key. You can figure out where you stand. What your number is. This is not a precise measurement at all, obviously. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, for all the psych testing that I do, there's not a single test on control. But it is borrowed from a friend of mine's book called Imperative People. And he put these together to give us a little bit of a fix on what this looks like. So, before we get started, let me provide you with a lighthearted look at this issue of control.
I like to think of myself as more of a control enthusiast. Perfect 177 degrees. And that's why this road warrior runs from National. I can bypass the counter and go straight to my car. And I don't have to talk to any humans unless I want to, and I don't. The National lets me choose any car in the aisle. Control. So what's the word? Sexy. Go National. Go like a pro.
They just released a new one, and I haven't gotten this one updated, the recent one, and he's taking a shower with his hair, and he even controls his hair. So, so just by way of refreshing your memory or nightmare, truth and reality is the base, and then of course control versus trust. And we'll lay this out in a little bit more detail when we go along here. One of the key issues about control is a subtle little piece of it that I would remind you of in this next video clip. Whoops.
This last entry was a little disturbing. The gloves are off, God. God has taken my bird and my bush. God is a mean kid with a magnifying glass. Smite me, almighty smiter. Now, I'm not much for blaspheming, but that last one made me laugh.
You spy on me? Who are you?
I'm the one. Creator of the heavens and the earth. Alpha and Omega.
Oh, I see where this is going.
I'm God.
Bingo! Yahtzee! Is that your final answer?
Our survey says
God! Bing, 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 bing. Well, it was nice to meet you, God. Thank you for the Grand Canyon, and good luck at the apocalypse. Oh, by the way, you suck! You know what would have been a little bit more impressive, though? If you hadn't used the cheesy file cabinet illusion. Anybody with a brainstem can tell that that drawer is being fed through the wall from the other side. All you have to do is find the crease right around here. There is a seam here. Or a hollow spot.
Where? Through the drywall and concrete?
Okay, that is a good one. That is a good one. Okay, how many fingers am I holding up?
Now, Bruce, thou shalt not tempt the Lord.
If you can't do it, man, that's cool.
3, 2, 4, 9, 6, 8, 1.
Okay. How many now?
7. You've been doing a lot of complaining about me, Bruce. Quite frankly, I'm tired of it.
Wait. Don't come near me, seriously. I'm back into a corner with a wild animal. I don't want to hurt you, but I will have instinct.
You haven't won a fight since grade 5, and that was against a girl.
Yeah, she was huge.
And the sun was in her eyes. Oh, there you go. In a way, I brought you here to offer you a job.
Job, my job.
My job. You think you can do it better, so here's your chance. When you leave this building, you will be endowed with all my powers.
Yeah, the funny thing about that video clip, and I've watched it many, many times, and it just occurred to me the last time I showed this, that the reality behind that scene was it actually reinforces our notion about God. He's got an entire filing cabinet full of things about all that we've done wrong. And if God doesn't have it, we do. We do. We catalog all of it. And that is the basis on which we approach all that we're talking about here. So how do we, the question is how do we play God? And the short answer is not only how we play, but why do we play God? And the short answer is because we don't trust Him. We say one thing and we live another. Our behavior betrays us every time. So the thing I would have you remember, a lot of you guys have heard me say this over and over again, control and trust cannot coexist. If I am engaged in controlling kinds of behavior, it is implying and suggesting that I don't trust the person I'm engaged in that behavior with. So, to put it all together, vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. If we're committed to control, then we will avoid vulnerability at all costs, but yet talk about its value, particularly for other people. And that's why this is such a key issue, is that we spend a lot of our time focused on all the things that we can't control, and yet it distracts us from all the things that we might actually be able to. And vulnerability clearly is one of those. Is that, as Brene Brown makes very clear, she says over and over again, that other people's vulnerability we admire, but our own we are repulsed by. Some of that has to do with, obviously, the control piece. Why be vulnerable when other people can make conclusions that I can't stop them from making about me? And so we wonder why our relationships are so shallow. And it's because we're spending all of our time trying to control what the other person thinks, rather than being known by the other person. So, the way that we go about playing God is whenever we try to control, one, our image, which I've already mentioned, and it's the furtherance of the stained glass self and maintaining it. As I've noticed in these two sections of this class, in the journals that I've been reading, people still are trying to do or reverse the path out from creating the stained glass to just creating a different one. And unfortunately, the path in is not the same one as the path out. So we manage our image, we manage other people and what they think and conclude. We often will say, I don't want you to think that, ... Or I don't want you to conclude that. And the challenge is, if somebody were really to be honest with us, they'd say, you can't. That's the risk. But if we want to experience the kind of trust that we say we want in our relationships, it will always come with risk. It can't not. So control and trust can't coexist. Trust and risk always coexist. Always. Most of our efforts in our relationships is trying to reduce the risk of trust. And by doing so, we end up trading. So maybe I can't control what other people think or what other people conclude about me, but I'll trade something with them. So I'll trade as much vulnerability as you do. I'll trade as much trust with you as you do. See, then it's safe, right? As long as it's even, and we can keep it even. Part of the issue that we have with that, in terms of trusting, is that one, we can't accept a free gift, and two, it's always uneven. At any given point in time when I trust somebody, it's uneven because they're offering me something that I can't give them in that moment. That's the risk. That is very much a part of it. So it's also whenever we try to control our problems. As a matter of fact, all problems. We refuse to see problems and shortcomings as a part of the journey of just trusting. They must be fixed or neutralized or put into a context where I'm getting over it rather than I'm in it. How often do we share our issues with people way, way, way after the fact rather than in the midst of what we're in? When do we need their help the most? When we're in the middle of it. When I'm in the middle of a battle, I need somebody to be with me. I don't need somebody to, after I've lost the battle, go to them and say I have. One thing I think I've said to you guys before, and I would remind you again, When Jesus left the disciples, he said, I will send you a counselor. I will send you the Holy Spirit. And he used a specific word which is really pretty profound. It literally is the word parakletos. In the Greek, it means one called to come alongside. It's not lost on his audience, particularly the Greek audience that these people were living within, or were influenced by, I should say, is that paraclete was not only a term, because we translate it as counselor, but paraclete had a military aspect to it too. And in military operations, the Greeks, when they would go out to war, they always would go out together in twos. So one man would walk forward, and the other man would have the other man six. In other words, his back. That was the image of a paraclete. The paraclete watches our blind spots. Jesus said, when I leave, I'll send you somebody who will help you be aware of the things that you're not aware of. The paraclete. One called to come alongside. Not one to lead, one to walk with me. And it's the embodiment of what Jesus was prophesied as being, God with us. Not for us, it certainly is for us, but with us. And that's a key aspect, I think, when we try to fix a lot of our problems. So another one, our pain. How do we play God? We fix our pain. We fix how people perceive us in our image. We fix things. But the problem with our culture today is the conclusion that all pain is bad. All pain is bad. And the reality is it's not. I would suggest to you that there are three different kinds, if you will, that conveniently break out. One is the pain that really does indicate destruction or something that's been damaged in some way. That pain clearly is an indication. One of the authors of the book, it didn't last very long with this title, but I'll just tell you this title first. The first version of the title for this book was Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants. It was written by an author by the name of Paul Brand. Paul Brand was a leprosy doctor. He worked on leprosy patients in a leprosarium in southern Louisiana. And he did all of his research and everything around leprosy, and he would go to international places trying to help people with this. Leprosy is not a skin disease. Leprosy is a disease of pain receptors turning off. The damage that you see to skin and everything else that's usually associated with leprosy is because people don't respond when they're hurt. So, I go walking out here and I step in a hole by accident and sprain my ankle. What do? I limp, right? I limp because it hurts. The pain tells me something's wrong. And so I shift the weight of my body away from that ankle so that it's taken care of. With somebody with leprosy, the syndrome that goes with this, they don't limp. They keep walking on a sprained ankle. And guess what happens? It gets worse. And it gets worse. And before too long, they go into the doctor or somebody notices that their foot is discolored. And before too long, they end up with gangrene in the foot, and they don't know it. They simply don't know it. And Brand used to tell horrifying stories. He would go to one story in particular. I remember he went to this village in India. It was a rural village, and he and another doctor walked up to the village, the entry to the village, whatever it was, And they noticed that the word had spread that these doctors were coming from America to help people. And they literally saw people kind of walking toward them. And one person in particular was walking toward them, and the closer he got, Brand noticed his foot, or the absence of it. He was walking on a raw tibia and fibula toward him without any understanding or any feeling of pain whatsoever. There was another person outside of the fire, and they were roasting potatoes. The potato fell into the fire. The old woman kind of nudges this guy, and he reaches into the fire and pulls it right out without feeling any of it. That's what leprosy is, okay? So it's not just a skin disease. It's something else oftentimes. And the thing about it is that if we say all pain is bad, then we end up not responding to any of it in a lot of cases. So there's damage that comes with pain. There's also damage or pain that comes with growth. I don't know how many of you have experienced, growth pains. That's what we call them, right? It's indication of growth. It's not something that you pop a pill for. It's just indication of the person growing. And then finally, the pain that really is just part of the journey. It is just part of what we experience when we deal with being human, which we tend to condemn as well. So, not all pain is bad. At some point on the backside of my surgery, I'm probably going to be in pain, but I will tolerate it for one main reason. Why? Because they repaired it. And the growth and the repair is the pain that brings about the kind of healing that I want. Here's another thing. Let's take a look at the anatomy of control and the thoughts that support it. We're going to look at the thoughts first, and then we will look at the feelings. The thoughts first is a commitment to performance and task completion versus relationships and connection. It doesn't mean that I take the focus off of task completion, but it tends to be driven by the getting something done. When I'm working on a project, I often become so focused that I get irritated when somebody interrupts me, and I tend to snap at them. The task is more important than the relationship and connection. We live in a society, certainly in Western industrialized societies, that is all about production. And the irritating part of being human is it's not all about production. It's about connection. And that's why we're having a class like this at all. Because of the issue of connection. It doesn't mean, be careful, it doesn't mean that I'm making a case for doing nothing at all. I'm not. The height of connection and task completion is a word that we get, collaboration. We work together at it. We do something together and appreciate as much of the relationship as we do getting the thing done. So that's one thought. Another thought that comes up is I'm uncomfortable with ideas that are different than my own. Insecurity oftentimes causes us to have a very low tolerance for people that have differing ideas and opinions. We might not ever say it. We might not ever say it. But it still lingers within us, that somebody sees it differently. I am serving on a committee. I hate committees, but I'm serving on a committee because I get to throw a party at the end of the spring semester for all the seniors called the baccalaureate. I've always done it myself, by myself. Well, now I get to be on a committee. It's irritating because it's with people that what? Have different ideas about how a baccalaureate is supposed to be. And I've gotten accustomed to just me being a committee of one. I get it done, it looks good, everybody's happy, and leave me alone. And the rest of the folks have different opinions. And I find myself wrestling with this one in particular, that I certainly love to say, I love to hear other people's opinions, subtext, as long as they're similar to mine, that's fine. But it's not so much a matter of whether somebody's going to come up with a better one than me. I just think I've got the best ones. So when somebody comes up with an idea different than ours, if we see it as a threat to our value as people, or a threat to whatever measure of authority we have, then it becomes a significant issue. Another one. I try to control as much of my life and people in it as possible. There are two different practices I want to make apparent to you. First, the obvious ones, which everybody can pick out: the manipulation, the bossiness, that escalating very quickly when somebody is interfering, giving unsolicited advice. A lot of times when people give unsolicited advice, they assume that theirs is the best, and therefore the person's life can't be enriched if they don't have your piece of advice. And those are the more obvious practices. Now, we talked a little bit about it in when we were talking about boundaries in terms of manipulative controllers versus aggressive controllers. But more obvious practices include this kind of thing. Somebody comes in, they establish themselves as the authority, the leader, and they tell everybody what to do and how to do it, and it all works the way it's supposed to. And it's the thought process underlying it that's the issue. As I've been saying before, when we were talking about the scandal of grace and the comfort of shame, and I was talking to you guys about the well reveals what's really going on here. Is that as long as I remain in control, I'm okay. The minute something starts flowing, kind of moving out of my control, then a lot of this downhill behavior starts showing up of these kinds of things. Another less obvious practices would include withdrawal. How is it controlling? Because I'm punishing people with my absence. Keep looking straight ahead. That's all I can tell you. Ignoring advice. People will tell me things and I won't do it. It's like, I'll be damned if I'm going to do that. Procrastinating, giving weak excuses, quietly uncooperative. We might all lay those out in the landscape of being quote unquote passive aggressive. Funny thing, the people we're trying to make a point to oftentimes don't get it. It's for our benefit, it's not for theirs. So, it's the preservation of me, myself, at the expense of others through dominance, whether it's obvious or subtle. And we don't see ourselves doing this stuff. We just don't. And the worst part about it is that oftentimes we don't have people in our lives that are willing to face the lion in the mouth and saying, do you realize what you're doing? I'd say it even more strongly. They don't care enough to do that for us. Because the people that really care for us are willing to risk our wrath because of the feedback they could be giving us. So, here's another one. If I haven't made you uncomfortable already, I often feel the drive to do something because it's my duty or my obligation. It is important to keep in mind that there is a difference between commitment versus obligation. Commitment is about a choice, a volitional choice someone makes. So when I recognize that my wife has had a terribly long day and is exhausted, I self-limit the things that I will do in order to help come alongside of her. It's not an obligation. I'm not doing it this is not an expectation of hers at all. But obligation robs people of the choice. And interestingly enough, when we do that, we end up discounting the choice that people make. If we see it as just an obligation or a duty that they do, we really then can't see that they've actually chosen to do it. I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with people where somebody has done something kind to them or for them, and they basically discount it by saying, oh, they're just the nicest person in the world. That's just them. And my response back to them is, yeah, but they chose to do that. They didn't have to do that. And they say, well, yeah, they did. And see, when we make things obligatory, we rob people of choice. And that gets in the way then of actually seeing a commitment somebody has made to self-limit on our behalf. And that happens a lot. So another one, it's difficult for me to admit my weaknesses, flaws, and shortcomings. We might hear the words, you're never wrong, or trying to write the ideal script for his or her life which never includes the ugly side. All of this feeds into this ideal script idea, feeds into expectations we hold when we walk into a situation or into a relationship with somebody, and the expectations we have of them without them ever knowing it. So we basically write a contract for them without them ever signing it. And then when they don't behave, we get mad. We get upset. We feel disappointed. We feel a variety of things because of the script that we've written about how these things are supposed to be. It doesn't take very much for an expectation to turn into a demand. It takes very, very little. So when you hear the annoying phrase, hold on to your expectations. You ever heard this before? Loosely. Or enter it with open hands. Those kind of euphemisms we tend to use. But there's a kernel of truth to it. Because I've sat and talked to people for a long, long time, and I have learned, let me add a parenthetical statement here. I have a lot of people say, well, if expectations are such a problem, then maybe I shouldn't have any. And I say, good luck. Because you can't exist without expectations. We're designed to have them. It's like, well, that's cruel of God. But the reality is expectations reduces the level of novelty of whatever the situation I'm in. Is that if I can predict, it's kind of what expectations are. If I can kind of predict the certain things, then I can really focus on the things that are really novel, that are really different here, that I can deal with. And all of that is to reduce one thing, right? The pain, the discomfort. All right, we're not talking pain. You end up thinking about broken legs and all that. We can reduce that down to just discomfort, and that's painful. So, another one, I don't like emotions or others to get out of control. The commitment to keeping tight control over all of the emotions is a package deal. This is what Brené Brown was talking about with numbing. You turn one off, you turn them all off. The interesting thing about it is when we do this with other people, they make the conclusion that we don't want to hear their feelings. They make that conclusion. Everybody does. So somebody starts expressing some emotions of whatever those are, and you have a solution or a fix for them, then the conclusion that happens in their head is feelings are irrelevant, even though they're the little t truth of my world. They are irrelevant and therefore are not part of the conversation. And I want you to be sensitized to that fact, because we lapse into big T truth all the time. And the minute we do with people that are expressing how they're feeling about something is where we really are not only invalidating their emotions and their feelings, we are invalidating them. That's how they experience it. And you can say, well, that's not fair. Tough. It is. That's how can I say that? That's how I feel. If I'm saying something to somebody about how I feel about a situation and I get slapped upside the head with a big T truth, I'm going to make one calculation in my head. Either I am never going to share that with that person again, or it must not be all that important, which then gets transferred into I must not be that important to them. So here's another one. I get irritated when other people make mistakes. Idealistic expectations of self and others. Our frailties and our flaws are not disliked, they're despised. And frustration boils over when others or I, because they are a function of me, don't perform at expected levels. See, this one has everything to do with boundaries. Because if people that I'm responsible for perform at a poor level, then it is a reflection on me, and I am therefore a poor leader, which makes it really impossible to be a good one. The same thing is true for a parent. If a parent sees their kid as a reflection of their good parenting or bad parenting, they will cease to become a very good parent. Because they're having to control the other person so that what? They appear okay. And that's why this one ends up biting everybody in one fashion or another. Because it's about the whole boundaries piece that we've been talking about. So frustration boils over. We're communicating to the other person that they need to perform at a higher level for whom. It's interesting, the one major kind of sports event I watch all the time, every year, is NCAA. And I heard a number of players talking about the different coaches that were part of the major teams, North Carolina, Duke, Tom Izzo at Michigan State. And almost all of it really caught my attention, is that all of these coaches seem to have this capacity to say to the players, you've got to be you. You've got to be more of you and be fully you, not for me, not so I can win a national championship. All of those coaches were all about coaxing the greatest potential out of that player that existed in that player for that player. And to a person, all of the players that were interviewed, all of them made that same basic kind of observation about the coach that they had. That the coach, they knew in their hearts that coach was trying to coax more out of them for themselves, not for them. They didn't care how they looked. Tom Izzo got really busted because he went after a player on the sidelines last weekend. And he said, I love Tom Izzo anyway, and he said, listen, I'll coach my players, period. That's all he said. In other words, keep your nose out of my business. I coach my players. The results show for themselves. And it's not about control. It's not about them. It's about coaxing the best out of their players. Here's another one. Well, that's all of them. Sorry. There weren't enough. So let's talk about the feelings that drive it. Now, one kind of frame I want to put out here at this point is that with all of these things that we're looking at, all of these are characteristics of the well. What I described after these were all downstream behaviors that indicated what was going on in the well. Okay? And remember, we're using well as a metaphor for our heart, and how well we care for it will have everything to do with the downstream behaviors we see that indicate things, and we have to pay attention to that. So the feelings are even more a part of that. Yeah, Jason.
You mean every part of the well is in the 6 parts of the pyramid, or just control?
No, it goes back to when I was talking about keeping the well clean in terms of trying to, because we tend to pay attention to the downstream behaviors, anger and lustfulness and all those sorts of things. So when we were talking about shame and grace, I made the the parallel to the metaphor of the well that the water is flowing out of. If we take care of the well, make some of the changes that we're talking about, then the downstream behavior will take care of itself. That's what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So feelings, the first one is the anger. And it obviously leads to resentment and bitterness. That's downstream behavior. The resentment and bitterness is downstream behavior. What's going on in the well is things aren't the way I want them to be, and I'm mad. In a lot of cases, anger is a front line emotion because it protects some other emotions that we're even more afraid of. But it's built on my demand that people conform to my expectations. And so our anger is an effort to get them to comply. And that's where anger comes in. Another one here is underneath it all is the fear. Anger is far easier to show because it pushes people far enough away so I don't feel vulnerable anymore. But what is it guarding? Well, it's guarding fear, and the reality is rarely will we ever admit this. Fear lurks in the background because a lot of our relationships are threatened. The connection is threatened, and when the connection is threatened, we experience this fear of what's going to happen next, and we start predicting the future and what is going to come out of this. So it oftentimes gets translated into a more socially appropriate version when it comes into defensiveness and accusations and don't you don't like what I do anyway, so that's why you're leaving. All of it. Fear drives a lot of what our behavior is. So feelings that drive it in terms of fear, denial shows it. Our unwillingness or refusal to admit the truth, what I would say is our rejection of our own humanity. That's this despising of our flaws and shortcomings. Accepting them, we are absolutely certain that if I accept my flaws and shortcomings, I will never get rid of them. The reality is how, if I follow that line of thinking, how do I get rid of something that I deny exists? I can't. I mean, logically, that doesn't stop me from trying. So, I mean, again, stuff that you've heard me say before, I'll just reiterate again. God is far more comfortable with your humanity than you are. And I say that because Jesus came to redeem it. So he accepted the reality of what it was and the redemption that it needed, sent Jesus so that we could actually have this kind of relationship that we're talking about. It can show up in evasiveness, avoiding contact, punishing by my absence. The funny thing about it is we don't think our presence is all that important until we start to withdraw it from people and see how much it manipulates them and challenges them. They start what? I start withdrawing. What do people typically do? They pursue. That feels pretty good, which means that I'll pull that card out at any time I have to in order to be assured that the person's still there and still going to come after me. So, evasiveness and then boomerang communication. The accused becomes the accuser. Suddenly I give somebody feedback and they say, yeah, but you, and then fill in the blank. You want to see this in spades, watch the news sometime. And somebody asks, one of the newscasters or whomever asks a politician in particular about somebody else, and they'll change the conversation to, yeah, but them. And that's the kind of boomerang communication we're talking about. Interestingly enough, it betrays fear. It betrays what goes on with fear. So another emotion is worry. Nothing's safe, is it? Feeling of apprehension or distress, uneasiness, always focused on the future. It's always focused on the future. In the old English, the definition was to strangle or to give pain. That's what worry was, which is very fitting. It strangles and paralyzes our view of the future. We predict a future and then react to it as if it's already happened. And that's what worry does. So the person is spinning their wheels in this worry, predicting a future that they don't know is going to happen, but they sure will. And then their body reacts, because our bodies do that. And then anxiety begins to percolate within. But worry is all about predicting a future that has not happened yet. It is captured by one phrase: what if? And the funny thing about that is it's stated as a question when in fact it's not a question at all. It's not what if it happens, it is when this happens. And then I grind my gears around what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? And usually, most of the time, the questions are asked but never answered. What am I going to do? No answer. How am I going to do it? No answer. It's just, I'm overrun with the worry around it. Another feeling in terms of worry is what I would refer to as just 4 fallacies that are related to it. One, the tendency to focus on minutia. A lot of things that grind our gears, spin our wheels around, and yet we're not really getting anywhere. It's a minutia. It's not stuff that really is going to have the biggest impact in the world, but it does generate a lot of energy. It does generate and dissipate a lot of the energy that we feel around this worry. The second one, which is the one I've already said, is the future will always repeat the past, which is really, it's really discouraging when you think about it that way, because essentially we're dismissing our ability to choose differently than the past. We're not really buying into the idea that I can do something different, or even better, I might actually have more resources now than I did then. But I end up discounting those as well, or lacking the confidence in me as far as being able to figure out the resources I need to address whatever the predicted catastrophe is. So there are 4 fallacies just under worry that we have to keep our eye on. Again, these are probably all things that any one of us has engaged in. How many you're going into the project season, right? And how many projects you've been engaged in where you stop yourself somewhere partway in and say, why am I doing this? This is not going to get me any farther down the road, but somehow I'm doing it for whatever reason. I was doing that yesterday. I was playing with podcasts, and I was thinking to myself, why in God's name are you doing this? You've got too much grading to do. Yeah, but it's so fun. So we all get caught in it. Another one, shame, not guilt. Shame drives control. All is based on the threat of one's identity and the change in behavior. That's why we are so committed to managing our appearance. We have settled for an appearance rather than an identity. And so we redouble our efforts around managing the image rather than living our identity. And that's what drives this thing along in terms of control and the feelings that go with it. It's not guilt. Guilt is motivating. Again, I would refer you back to, and I mentioned this already, I think, in this class, the 2 Corinthians 7, when Paul says, worldly sorrow leads to death, but godly sorrow leads to life. Worldly sorrow is shame. It paralyzes, it does all these things we've just identified. Godly sorrow, guilt, healthy guilt, motivates. It convicts, but it motivates. Because I compare it against a value that I have and say, all right, let me try this a little bit differently this time. So, the anatomy that goes into it. Now, I have raised enough of your angst to say, all right, Mitch, if you're going to talk about this stuff, at least give us a solution. Well, what's the antidote? Well, I'm not sure you're going to like the antidote anymore. Merry Christmas. There are 3 keys. And they're keys to relationship. And the first one is choice. It is the antidote. It is to empower another to own him or herself. And it's to expand the choices that are available to the other person. When we're bent on controlling things, we're bent on stealing choices from people. We don't see it that way. I am not saying, that when you recognize that in yourself or the things that you do, that you say, oh, I'm stealing choices from my friend. No, you don't think that at all. You think you're doing it for their welfare, which is a whole rationalization that we don't need to get into. But how do I empower the other person to make their own choices? So when I ask somebody something to do for me, whatever it might be, and I add at the end of my request, and no is an acceptable answer, it's empowering the person to choose freely. Because freedom is always the centerpiece of the antidote to control. It puts a priority on relationships that allows others to be who they are, and it allows me to be who I am. The one thing I would remind you of, and I know that I've probably said this before, is probably the most remarkable thing, because we're zooming up on Easter, probably the most remarkable thing that God did in Jesus and his death and resurrection was to give us freedom and give us the ability to choose. That is absolutely stunning. So stunning, it never occurred to Satan how he was being hijacked. It's really, truly remarkable. Because God was so committed to us having the choice. Because if we can choose to love him, we can also choose to not, which makes the choice matter. He knew as long as we were, as Scripture says, dead in our sins and dead spiritually, dead people can't choose. Live people can. So freedom. And the last thing is cultivating humility, is being realistic about what I have the capacity to do and what I don't. It's a realistic appraisal of me, not built on shame, but built on the realistic understanding of what I do well and what I don't do so well. And that's a changing target. It always will be. Is that I may have a whole set of skills, and at one particular point in time, it may not even occur to me to use those skills. That happens. It does. It's called being human. It's not an excuse for sin. That is not what I'm talking about here. But living with my humanity means I identify things that are sinful. I identify rebellious patterns in myself. But I don't have to beat the snot out of myself to do that. Jesus got beaten for it. I need to say, oh, that's what it is. Maybe I can do something differently next time. And that's part of the backdrop that we have to always take a look at and understand. So, the cultivating of humility in terms of realistic appraisal of self and not built on shame, it's about cultivation. It's not about producing. We've gotten a long, long way away from the agrarian society that our nation was founded on. Jesus uses a lot of farming examples in a lot of the things that he points to. And cultivation is this acknowledgement of my own personal limitations and choosing to be guided by a modest sense of self-importance, not an inflated sense, and not a self-deprecating sense. And I'm not sure we know how to do this very well. For one main reason, we have gotten drilled so much about being prideful that we can't even look at ourselves realistically. And that interferes with living fully where we are, who we are, our limits and everything, not adding shame to it, and entering into the relationship or whatever that is on the basis of just who I am. quite honestly, I think if anybody had reason to brag about how powerful he was, Jesus had it. And yet we get pictures time and again of him during his ministry and with people, and he oftentimes never reminded them of who he was and the power that he had. As a matter of fact, he spent most of his time telling people to shut up about who he was. Why do you think people got so drawn to him? I would suggest because of this. He wasn't trying to be humble. He understood what he was, who he was, and what his mission was. He didn't have any flaws. We do. But condemning our flaws is not a way to live with them. Cultivating self-acceptance that's based in grace is. Okay, let me stop. I'll let you breathe. Any questions, comments? Yeah.
What do you think, like, the relationship of discipline is, like, with commitment and obligation? Where's the line?
Yeah, well, and I think discipline falls under commitment. You know, I choose to be disciplined. Now, it can easily lapse into an obligation, okay? But I think, particularly when we talk about the spiritual disciplines and those sorts of things, those are voluntarily entered into. They're not made compulsory for our salvation. They're entered into voluntarily to what? Deepen our relationship with God. So it's the commitment to doing that, and it's always tied to a relationship. Obligation is not tied to a relationship. It's tied to getting what I want and getting somebody to do what I want. And so it's robbing their choices. And the minute I rob choices, I'm diminishing relationship then. So discipline fits. It does. We've just got to understand that it's all about the choices that we make to constrain ourselves, to self-limit. And that's a commitment I make voluntarily. So it's a great question. Any other questions or anything? Okay, well, brace yourself, because next week, I'll just forewarn you ahead of time so you know what you're getting into, is this. Love you later, bye.